Alright, this is going to be a basic video demo on how to create a pinch pot. So you're going to start out with about a fist-sized amount of clay, and you also want to have some sketches ready. I have a couple different options here, and I'm going to try to make this one, which is a little more challenging of a shape for a pinch pot. This would be a little simpler. So we're going to see how clay, and of course I'm going to wedge it just like we've done before when starting working with the clay. And remember, when wedging, you want to push your heels through and you're basically folding the clay back over on itself. So when you push it through and then roll it back, you're creating this fold in the clay. So it's kind of like folding it over and over again on itself. And once again, we're just working out the consistency of the clay so that the moisture content is the same throughout, releasing any air bubbles that may be in there, and just in general getting it ready to be moved and shaped. Okay, so we don't need to wedge more than a couple minutes, 2-3. All right, so I'm gonna call that good. Next thing you need to do is form your clay into a ball. And I'm gonna start doing that with the heels of my hands, kind of smoothing everything out. And I can roll it around a little bit as well. All right, and now what shape you want to make your pinch pot will kind of determine the shape that you start with. If you want to make something that opens up a little wider like this, more like a bowl or a wide open cup, starting with just a ball will work out just fine for you. All right, so I'm going to roll out that shape a little bit so it's just a little bit taller. Something to start with. Don't need to go too far. Just rolled it out a bit, and then I'm going to kind of make a little base to start with by just gently tapping it on the table. So I'm kind of creating a little bit of a flat bottom for myself here. Okay, so then I'm ready to start making the form of the pot. So first thing I'm going to do here is going to be to insert my thumb into the middle, what I deem as the middle of the top. Okay, so I'm going to find that middle as best I can and just start pressing my thumb in a little ways. And I actually want to press it until there's about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 inch left between my thumb and the bottom. So about that much space, as well as I can judge. Okay, once I've got it there, I'm basically going to start pressing out with my thumb. I'm going to rotate the pot with my other hand. And I got my fingers on the outside supporting it, and then my thumb is kind of pressing out, starting at the bottom of the inside. So I'm starting to form that clay. And since I'm making a taller shape, I also want to be conscious that I'm pulling the clay up. So kind of with the thumb and with the outside fingers, I'm working on pulling that clay up because I want a taller shape, not necessarily a wider shape. If I did want a wider shape, I could focus more a little bit on pushing my thumb outward. But for the shape I'm going for, I'm working on pulling it up. And it's always a little easier to push outward than it is to pull upward. So if you're not sure what shape you're making, I would always start by kind of trying to pull the clay upward. And for a while here, I'm gonna ignore the top. I'm not gonna come all the way to the top. I'm just gonna keep pulling the clay up gradually because I don't want this part to get too wide open or too thin. If it gets too thin, it'll crack. If it gets too wide open, it'll be really difficult to pull back into the shape that I want it, that narrower opening. So I'm just gradually rotating. I don't want the clay to get thinner. It's pretty thin right there, about 1/4 of an inch thick. I don't want it to get thinner than that. So if I've gotten it that thin, then I'm gonna work up a little higher. Start working this thicker amount of clay here. And this is a gradual process. Don't try to rush it. You can't force the clay into the shape you want it. You gotta work it gradually. And keeping this part tight in here. to get that more narrow opening that I'm looking for. So then I start to get up towards the top. I'm purposefully pinching this clay inwards. I'm drawing it up and in. I don't want that circle there to get any smaller or any wider. I want to keep it nice and small. So it really helps to have the shape in mind from the beginning that you're trying to make. Now I also wanted to make it narrower at the bottom, like you can see here. So that's something I might start to address now. I want to pull that clay up from the bottom. Oops, pulled a little off. And it's thicker in here anyways, so I'm kind of going to push that clay back in from around the bottom, supporting it on the inside also. And then I'll work that clay up, just like I did before. So I'm pressing it in to make that narrower base that I wanted. Being careful not to widen the opening too much here. Okay, so I'm getting there. And then this clay I'll work up again. You want to do this if you're going to kind of mold the bottom before the pot gets too tall, because already it's a little hard to get my whole hand in there around it to pull that up. Okay. Kind of roll the pot a little bit too to flatten out those sides. Okay, so this is where we're at so far. Getting there. It's still pretty thick, so I still got more clay to work up. And again, as I'm coming towards the top, I'm trying to keep that opening nice and narrow. And you gotta feel how thick the clay is. You want to be careful to keep it, that's why you're rotating all the time. Keep it the same consistency or the same thickness throughout the pot. If you get a thinner spot, it's going to make it weak. So you're kind of gently pinching and coaxing and molding the pot into the shape that you want. Pulling that clay up. Now what's going to happen a little bit with the top, it's going to start to dry out a little bit and get a little cracked. You just want to get a little water on your fingers and moisten that out. You'll have to do that a few times just to keep that top moist enough to work with. I'm trying to keep working that opening inward so I'm not widening that out, but I'm continuing to stretch and pull the clay up, making this a little wider. You can kind of see how I'm pushing out with my finger a little bit here to create that rounded shape a little bit. So I'm pressing out from the inside, trying to be careful not to widen my opening. gonna go ahead and try to narrow out this bottom a little bit more, supporting it on the inside with my fingers, making sure I don't get too thin anywhere, but pressing this clay up a little bit. So I just narrow out that bottom. Making sure I'm not pressing too hard, not getting the clay too thin anywhere, but my fingers on the inside. Just working towards that shape that I want. Okay. So then I'll have to carefully pull that up. Gotta make my hands work together on this. Okay, so I've got that narrow at the base now again. Kind of roll it a little bit to keep that round shape on the bottom. All right, and I'm getting pretty close to that shape that I want. It's narrow at the bottom, narrow at the top. So I'm kind of working towards finishing it now. You want to work fairly quickly when you're making a pinch pot, just because it can dry out, and once it dries out, if you try and keep bending it and moving it, it's going to crack. As it loses moisture, it loses its plasticity, which is its ability to be molded and shaped. Okay, now once I think I've gotten to that point where the walls are pretty even all the way around, I've got it fairly smooth. Now it's never going to be perfect on the outside. That's part of making a pinch pot. It's going to look hand-built. You want to try to smooth it out with your fingers just like this as much as you can, but a little bit of that bumpiness, that's just part of making a hand-built pot. Okay, smoothing with my fingers. Okay, so now I smooth any cracks. If there's any cracks forming anywhere, just get a little water on your finger, smooth it out. Okay, now the top. You can see that the top is a little uneven, a little wonky. Now, to even that out, okay, we have a few of these turning pedestals that we can share. You can set your pot on that pedestal there. And then you want to get down to level with it. And as you spin it around, you want to find the point that looks to be the lowest. You're going to use this as just a basic cheese cutter, but this wire will help us cut the top of the clay. So you want to get it in the middle as much as possible so it looks centered as it spins. Find that low spot and hold your hand very steady as you turn the wheel, and it should cut it out pretty evenly for the top. You can get down eye level and inspect, and I think mine's a little wonky still, so all right, so we're pretty good there. So now it's pretty close to being level all the way around. Not perfect, but better. Okay, so once again, I'm just gonna kind of pull my top in a little bit, and then I'm gonna smooth out the edges. So you can see that once your opening has widened, it's very difficult to bring it back in. So as you're making the pot, you have to be very conscious to keep your opening as narrow as you're going to want it to be. Okay. So I'm going to use just a little bit of water on my fingers, kind of smooth out those edges. If I want to use the turning table a little bit, I can. Okay, and so there's what I've ended up with. So right away I could probably take a needle tool, carve my initials into the bottom, or however you like to sign your name, if you want to sign the whole thing. I'm just going to put my initials and the date. It's always nice to date your pieces because then looking back on them you can remember when you made them. Alright, now next step I'm going to do is plan out my pattern to put on the sides of my piece, but I'm going to let it dry just a little bit, let it sit out, or if I'm leaving for the day, let it sit in a bag without paper towel covering it. Just let it dry a little bit so we're ready to carve in and add our patterns and textures. So thank you for watching.